Hello, everyone, and welcome to Masterclass. This is Dr. Aaron Sheley. I'm from YouTube Masterclass. Coursera. Coursera is an education program that helps people to finish college. And you already know that because if you're taking this course, you're pretty much enrolled in Coursera if you're getting credit for it. So the credit that comes from Coursera is given to your whole report that has all your grades and has all your classes that you can find one of those at the registrar at the university you attend. That's great. This is specifically adjunct professor for USC, Calarts, and Harvard, and it's a film class on Orson Welles. And by film, we mean film studies. So, what's film? Like, film is cinema. Cinema is like movies and film. There are movies and film, and that's in cinema. So, you kind of see how you can bracket it out into these definitions. But cinema would be like you're going to a movie palace and you see it on this big screen and it's wide and big. The only reason we all know that, why we bring this to mind, is the phenomenological explanation of how we're seeing a world that's seeing us. And I'd actually been recording this lecture before, and this lecture's late, but we can stay on topic and get through this class together because I faced some hard things in this class, and it has nothing to do with the subject matter. And that's what you'll find out about school, is that there's so many things that happen outside of it that doesn't really pertain to the class, because in this case it's history, film history. And film history is pretty harmless because it takes the pieces together how they happened, but doesn't really gossip about anything. And I don't really consider that even to be optional in actual criticism, because that's not really thinking critically about the situation, like how it's none of our business what someone behind the scenes does at home, technically, compared to how things in the class are set up to demonstrate who Orson Welles may have been and who he was as an artist, to analyze how he would stylistically create a narrative or a film or a scene or a shot or even a commercial, or all these different types of media that Orson Welles worked in, with all these different types of geniuses of the silver screen. And Orson Welles goes back to 1941. I mean, before that with Hearts of Age, right? We kind of talked about that in our first lecture, but I kind of gave you an overall look. And there's not much you can say about Hearts of Age other than it's got tons you can say about it. Like, for instance, it extrapolates. It extrapolates. You're like, okay, there's the black character, there's him, there's sort of this racist connotation, there's this weird piano, and it's got all these total objects moving around. And what he's doing is pointing fact to the fact that he likes to open the movie for people to see things that are outre, or different, and a sort of scattered avant-garde that you never really can understand the meaning of, but you're not really trying to derivate that as much as you're trying to derivate a philosophical statement. And so, from the director or genre that defines what the narrative looks like behind that phenomenological glance, or gaze, we should say. And the gaze is when you're staring right at the screen at this point, and you're looking at it and you're kind of taking all the elements in at once. And that's kind of how the classical Hollywood worked with even a big screen. They're using this editing that's only 3 seconds long. And so if the editing in Hollywood classical cinema is 3 seconds, they've got a shot. Now they shoot 6 or 7 seconds of that shot and then trim some to have sides on it, but there's more than that. It's like they have 10 minutes of sides on them. And so you can take the clip out and then put it into the film grand narrative that you're building out of the different strips of film that you're literally cutting and pasting. We don't use that term anymore. We now say editing. It's editing, and that's what they would have said when it was Orson Welles, and that Orson Welles can function as a montage. This does mean he knows how to do completely closed states of matter that's showing to the audience that he's objectifying or in whatever way, and subjectifying in whatever way, that's creating kind of this film noir appeal. And the film noir appeal kind of originates with him and Hitchcock, all the way back to 39 Steps, which is only a few years earlier, than Orson Welles in 39 Steps and Stagecoach and all that later, that decade in the 30s, 1930s in Hollywood classical cinema. And of course, Hitchcock was in Great Britain. And he would eventually come in 1940, comes over with Rebecca, and Rebecca is totally related to Citizen Kane, not just because they were given out the same year, but because they had the same kind of set design. I'm not sure if it's the same set designer, but you do know that the cameraman for Citizen Kane was the cameraman for Stagecoach. And when Stagecoach got on Orson Welles' mind, he just watched it repeatedly. I mean, I've already said that. Like, he would watch repeatedly all these things that were happening in his films, and then he'd film it, and then he really wouldn't have to repeat looking at it, not necessarily until after Citizen Kane, because you have to have the knowledge that what you did was exactly like you wanted, and in that, to be someone like Orson Welles, because he comes in from the Houseman Theater, from Hearts of Age and all that, from all these movies in this traditional background of New York theater, that he gets involved in the New York theater in ways that John Cassavetes later will, with the Housemans, is interesting, and that there's this sort of interracial tension, because they all want to integrate to where actors and can all be together no matter what their race is. And Orson Welles has nothing against this, and he's sort of trying to build money for the Houseman Project when he builds this sort of War of the Worlds thing. And we talked about War of the Worlds, how he's freaking everybody out. Well, finally, it all slides over to the Houseman Theater and everybody else, the Mercury Theater, which becomes RKO, and RKO is founded off of this, is when he takes the scenes from older movies and recapitulates them. Like, he looks at a scene and films it and recapitulates it to some other timeline. Then it's a movie, but it's got bits and pieces that tell the story of a different movie. Like, not exactly where they come in the movie, but kind of the same kind of actions that go on. And I'm sure, and Orson Welles wrote a script with Joseph Mankiewicz. Now Mankiewicz is a really powerful Hollywood player that in the classical era and coming up to the modern, especially the pre-modern, coming up to it being like this sort of, and by modern I mean the era we're in now, except it was the people that derivated it from classical, and that's like, you think Andy Warhol, Kenneth Anger, and Stan Brakhage are sort of these postmodern modern gods of like what modernizes cinema, because again you're working with one shot, and then you go to the next one, you don't have to have the line on there. So Orson Welles says, let's expand the time that the shot is on, and then that way it can go longer on the audience's appeal to it, because it's so decorative. And beyond decorative, there's something happening in it. There's like this action. It's like delaying time, but it's not doing it in like a frenetic way that like we're supposed to wait in these long sort of like shots that go on forever. Like The Passenger has that one long take at the end that goes on 12 minutes. That's a lot different than 3 seconds, I mean, like, it has a different psychology on you, and that's why Orson Welles went to that. He kind of started the noir, did the deep focus long take, and from that, we get like RKO, we get Italian cinema, coming up, Italian modern cinema, and even like all the things that came in the silent era that were interesting to Orson Welles, he saw in a film club, and so he's like putting him into his movie at times that he thinks that action should happen, and he's taking it from different ones. Like, for instance, that is watching Stagecoach so much, it doesn't come out looking Citizen Kane like Stagecoach all the way. It doesn't at all. It's totally night and day, but that it comes from it shows the way that films derivate with each other that only a director can really see. And that's why sometimes when they say it's like this version of this, they perceived it a certain way that they want to shoot it as, the director usually. But they don't necessarily want to give away the source, or if they do, people will argue that wasn't like the source, and then you'll have one of those like John Ford shootings again. No, I'm kidding, but you know what I mean. It's like, if the shot was shot textbook, it would be shorter because you would just look up at it and it keeps changing. every three, and sometimes it would even be up to like 9 seconds in the early classical era. A lot of that is because of how long it takes for the sound device to turn on and turn off, and that you can only afford so much in a daytime to get more than 6 second shot. Well, it's more than that. It's like they'll get a couple of minutes shot per day, and then the whole shoot's 120 days, or whatever, or 90 days is the limit on classical. So, like, that studios have this efficient, but that it still is a slow, easygoing, well, not easygoing, because Orson Welles is like frenetic all the time, but easygoing film is what I meant. Like that it takes you through these long takes. Is like, like Rocco and his brother, for instance, isn't easygoing. That's the wrong way to describe it, but I mean, like, that the shots linger out. Like, the Rocco and his brothers, like, these devastating shots are coming across the scene of this family and these different people, and it's got this, like, sort of Terra Trima theme to it. And all the shots are like the Orson Welles shot, where they're deep focus, long take. And that means that everything in the shot can be seen, and it goes on longer than the old classical one, that it does, like, again, say, lead to the passenger. So what do we kind of take from this thought that Orson Welles is molding this new style of cinema, this maybe even postmodern style? I mean, the coming of Hitchcock is right around that same time to America, but Hitchcock has done all this work all the way back to the 20s, and Orson Welles is the newcomer. Like, he's the young one among all these, like, legends of directing. Like, John Ford stays in the business for another 20 years, and so does Hitchcock and all that. So they'll work alongside Orson Welles, and kind of as he develops through his career, he influences more people than influence him, although many people influence him. I mean, you take all the influences and all the ones out, it doesn't exactly have to even out. It's not possible to find out what exactly the exact critical reception was of an event, except you can use LexisNexis, and we talked about that. We don't need to talk about that again, so I'll just move on. That's just a little hint that that's where you do your best research. But don't just go into it, and you have to get permission to use it from the dean of your school. If it were me, I'd say we all have good search engines like that, but some of them are more complex and don't exactly make sense. So there's never, even the most accurate research cannot lead you to something subjective like how was he liked in his career, how was he enjoyed in his career. You can certainly have these things that say when Citizen Kane came out, nobody liked it. I mean, everybody was against it when it first came out. Now it's like this meteoric rocket in everybody's eyes, and it's just beautiful, and I agree. But back then, the audience was booing it. Somehow it won an Oscar, and it was a big, tragedy that it ever did. And then it was like controversial that he made a film about William Randolph Hearst, and suddenly everybody loves him again, and he doesn't want anybody to, and likes the movie Citizen Kane, And William Randolph Hearst, being the one that Kane is based on, is already problematic because it's like documenting a bio, but then, like, all of a sudden it kind of veers off into this murder mystery or this death mystery. It's not a murder mystery, sort of. When I first saw it, I thought somebody killed him, when he shoots the gun. Somebody's shooting at him, You don't really know which cause of death he has. We talked about that in film criticism, and these critical agendas for teaching his films are important to film school because he's the one that's going to basically define the language of modern cinema, along with Hitchcock and basically with Welles. Because Orson Welles is going to take these old movie clips and put them in deep focus long take, put them in this sort of film noir shadowy look, and then influence the world to do the same, because he never gave up on the fact that he was the one that got the final say as to how that movie goes. And that's really hard to figure out, because at that time directors really didn't have a lot to say on the film. They directed it, and they did what they were told, though, but not necessarily to the point that they couldn't stylize it a little. But the house style of the studio was completely impinged upon the style of classical cinema, that the modern film came about from a readjustment of the classical cinema. That Dr. Caligari is sort of the shadowy film, shadow world. There's all these things. It's Robert Vini. It's from Silent Era in Germany. And this is going to sort of define the lighting of Orson Welles' shots, that he wanted to light it like an expressionist, isn't just sort of an avant-garde thing. It's like a movement to say, I get to control this film and I'm going to show you why. And he's showing us why because he's adjusting the style. And before that, directors could add the style the way it was said. But by style, we mean the formula that he uses to repeat his way through a movie, because he uses the same kind of concept each time, and this makes him an auteur. But we aren't studying him as an auteur. We're studying his films. And it does require taking time to learn about him. And we do feel like auteur studies on Orson Welles would be good, but right now his biography is still kind of revising and coming out with the things that he did in his life, because a lot of it had been conquested and not recorded. Some of it hadn't been recorded and conquested. It didn't really seem to be the same movie every time. It doesn't with Orson Welles. But you can see like Journey into Fear and how that's kind of this lost film, and it's really hard to find, and there's more than one version of it, and it doesn't even have the same actors movie to movie, and it's sort of this movie that you're like, well, we know Orson Welles directed it, but we don't know what became of it, or like, we kind of have it, but there's only one print. There's kind of some stories behind it that it was a banned film because Orson Welles wasn't supposed to direct it and did. But when the audience first got bummed about Citizen Kane, they didn't like how it was depressing. They didn't like how Citizen Kane, the William Randolph Hearst and Orson Welles playing him at all different ages, considering which montage is where, because the montage to age him works. But that Orson Welles becomes the sort of character, and it's kind of scary because he shows so much emotion. And it's weird because I don't think the real William Randolph Hearst really had much emotion. Like, he might have had emotion just to yell at a newspaper guy. I can understand that. Like, everybody's at your throat, and when you're in that media business, and nobody can get the thing done that they want to so much, that's their project, and Orson Welles comes out and does it first. His own pet project, and he does it first. So, like, for a while, people were booing mainly because it was a depressing movie. I know there's a lot of film school talk that there's other reasons, like it didn't look right to them, and that's probably true. It seemed like expressionistic. Yeah, I can see that. The Houseman Theater has made him too theatrical in acting, but there's some documentary realism too, and when you add those, it kind of gives you that realism plus the surrealism edge. Like, you can kind of jive it together, and I hate to use that word, I hybridize it. I'm trying not to use the word hybridized, it seems like that word can be misused because it seems like a scientific term. But in this particular case, that is formula versus formula from another formula can in fact make the style dramatic in that way, and we can rely on this sort of Orson Welles freedom when it comes to independent film. Like, the modern independent film was absolutely taken from this. Modern film was excised from the films of Andy Warhol, Kenneth Anger, and then later postmodernism, I guess, would be more like the Stan Brakhage, although he was working in the same time that Orson Welles was, but earlier on. And there's all these interviews in history that Peter Bogdanovich does, these interviews with Orson Welles, and he says that with Citizen Kane, it was kind of this nightmare of traps, that everyone was getting hustled in and hustled out, that people were running hither and thither, that the whole soundstage was aglow with a mass disaster, And the editor takes the cinematographer's actual solid film, and the sound designer comes on, and he's like, well, it's a sound film, let's get these long takes, their sound back, even though it was a sound apparatus that they were challenged with sometimes, even as far as the 40s, when they already had a sound system set up in the 27 with Jazz Singer. And Jazz Singer, again, does that thing where, like, the guy is playing another whatever ethnicity, and then he comes out and does that. And then you get on to, like, Singing in the Rain. That's pretty common in, like, this vaudeville setting, that, like, everybody's looking like that. And I'm not supposed to say these things in Orson Welles' class, but the reason I do is because he abolished all that. I mean, he had it sort of in his film, but he critiqued it by taking these kind of, like, images that were always confusing and keeping them confusing, like that their artistic meaning was just phenomenological, and it's how it sets on your brain when you see it is kind of what we're looking for in these kind of, like, it's more like your mind. Your eyes see something and record it on your mind, and your mind stores it in your brain, and you kind of see this picture in front of you. That's why the film is square like that, because the pictures in front of us are square. Pictures when they first were taken, were square. And why that is because you're taking a selection out of the universe to record in freeze frame in a photo. That's the way I look at it. It's not really that. It's recording its exact instant at that moment. And it's like, that's what you take with you when you've taken a picture. So if you keep taking pictures in a row, then it makes it look like they're moving, especially if they move a little bit between. I mean, it makes it look like they're moving like simultaneously, that the whole picture's one, that everything's actually working according to this exact science. Well, they had to rip some of the science up and start again. And so there's already frustrated technicians, frustrated engineers. The final editor's coming after Orson Welles, and I want that print back to take the depressing things out. And it's like, well, it's not depressing. It's part of the theatricality of us representing, Charles Foster Kane, who is William Randolph Hearst. But we change the name because when we do a bio of someone, it's not always the story of Louis Pasteur. We said that, It isn't always that, where they take the name and match it up directly. There's a lot of metaphorical characters that are then in place of someone that is, these characters, in other words, that are hard to play, are not whether or not the actor's good or not necessarily. Sometimes the actor has to do what he does in Kane and pretend he's a bad actor or not be an actor at all, and then come out with all the fine performances of his role change. Because if he's too good of an actor, it's not only artifice is showing, it's more that Kane is being misrepresented because he was just kind of a regular going guy. But the movie makes him so epic. In the re-edit, the only responsibility was Orson Welles stood by the print and wouldn't let anybody in to try and take pieces out and make their own version, which the studio wanted to do. His producers definitely wanted to do that. So he thought, well, if I do this, I'll save the movie. And he did save the movie, but it's like, the problem is that the movie still wasn't accepted till later, when the modernism became more prominent in independent film, became more prominent. But his film was key because he realized he saved the film, but he also defended the footage against taking another direction, editing, which would have happily at the time taken the depression out of the film. But believe it or not, there are actually movies in the silent era that are pretty melodramatic. Almost all the silent era is melodramatic. So we take this kind of new genre that's emerging in sound, and 10 years later it's the male melodrama. And so now we have this kind of suspense thriller look to a bio of a male melodrama. There's just him hitting all these different keys of emotion, and he's finding all this, he almost finds meaning to it all in Citizen Kane, but right when it slipped out from under him, he just starts yelling at everybody, and it's all because he's the boss. One thing I didn't get about that movie is if we're supposed to really feel bad that he's so mad, because I didn't feel bad that he was mad. I thought Citizen Kane had every right to be mad. I thought he was given everything that he wanted, yeah, but then when it didn't work out his way, it wasn't so much that. It was that he took preventative measures for it all not to tank, William Randolph Hearst and all this, for the news media to carry on. And his only return for that was everybody screwing it up from the way he wanted it. And I'm not saying these are bad newspapermen. These are top-of-the-line newspapermen. So by the time he hires them, you think he's going to be okay because his company is running and he's got all those newspapers going, and there's still big newspapers that are going out, and then he loses governor, and that's what makes him mad. So you have all these waves of emotion. First, he's disappointed he can't get anything done, really, in a way. He's kind of sitting around being rich, waiting for it to happen. And then finally, he's given this sort of chance, And it's Orson Welles' own purpose kind of parallels this. It's Orson Welles being this sort of, out of nowhere contender, comes up with these avant-garde movies. They're pretty good. We're all right with that. But that Orson Welles went on to direct these films after that period of being in early avant-garde cinema. He takes he takes Citizen Kane and he reloops it through this kind of wheel and makes it even shadowier on the printout while he's kind of adjusting it, and then he guards it. And what I'm saying here is that's independent cinema is born because he saved the film and because it's a deep focus long take that he pushed it through. It's independent film is born because he did it all because it was him that wanted the project, and from the beginning of the project to the end, he was the director of all that. See, on some Hollywood classical movies, and even today, sometimes everybody makes the movie, or one person kind of pushes out and makes the movie, but everybody in it has always made the movie. And then you go back to the silent era, and you're thinking all these casts of all these people are all sort of like blocked out somewhere. And I have to wonder what they even did. I mean, to get all that done, because I mean, there's so many people. There's so many people all over a city, like for instance in Hunchback of Notre Dame. And they're all kind of swelled around the Hunchback, and you're like, all these people are accounted for? Today, that'd be hard to do only because those shots don't have any of their faces, and they kind of look like this faceless crowd. I mean, you look at like Alexander Nevsky, and it's supposed to be the faceless crowd, and you're going like, I wonder if they intended that or not, and it's like, with Kane, there's probably a version where the characters are wiped out, cut out cardboard or something like in John Vigo's Zero for Conduct, but in Kane, he knocks them down without turning them to wood. I mean, these guys are like, there's actually other versions that have even like these senators that are like oppressive, In the battle over Citizen Kane, it had like this whole oppressive community of politics enter into it in sort of this vague debate type thing where they're going after it, and it sounds like the War of the Worlds piece already. So I don't know, that probably doesn't exist just because films do die. I mean, the vinegar syndrome is where you smell it, and if it smells like vinegar, it's a dead film. I mean, it's going into pieces. That's when it's first about to die, and you got to rescue it, So I'm not saying that Wells was protecting his things to rescue him for the vinegar syndrome. He was rescuing him from the producers or anyone else changing how he wanted the sequence to go. So now we can see that it was really his film and that he directed it from the beginning. I mean, you could tell with him in the movie that he's sort of underplaying it sometimes and overplaying it other times, and that's how he does the melodrama, because he wants to bring back this kind of like deep root in the mythos of society that defines the male genre or the male representation in narrative. And that the females in the film are kind of subject to his own, or they're kind of objects to his own subject, They're kind of like, he subjects it over the women almost like he's like a harem leader or something. And I know that word is very disturbing, but we don't need to talk about that. It's just like, there's even a scene with that in it, and I think that's why it's appropriate, is because there's a scene with that in it. We'll move on. Kane was coming out, and he's like, I'm really happy with this new organization, he says in the film, and then like later it's like, now things have gone so wrong, we can't keep it going. And that's the whole like trajectory of the movie by Erich von Stroheim called Greed. It's this whole up, it's like Casino, the movie by Martin Scorsese. It's like this whole up, increase in confusion and calamity, and then it all goes downhill and races down to the death of the person. And these can be like this male angst or this male predicament that they're in just by being male. Like they're trying to run the family and run the job and run the politics and run the religion, of the family. Traditionally in American film, men pick that because they pick it in real life. They're always given the option of picking the religion, although I've never had a chance to do that. I'd like to see that happen. I'd be like, no, I really wouldn't. So I like that about Orson Welles, that he's kind of like a-religious, they just kind of like, he doesn't talk about it in any of the film. They kind of do this thing where there's no God in the movie, I don't even think the word is in the movie, God. And I only refer to that word if it's film gods. But even that seems like not enough to complexize the director in general, because it's like, you can't, just because they have the style for one film, is it the same exact for the next? Well, it's the same style, because style stays with the director when they're represented by the um, film as a certain way, as a character in it, or that the style is represented in imagery and some sound collusion. And that's what Orson Welles figured out, is that the imagery and sound collusion were actually the more important parts of all of his movies, all the way to his last movie, F for Fake, where he plays a magician, and in the magicianry he hides things from the screen and then reveals them, and he's using real magic, because like now Orson Welles was like training to be a magician. But we see the style of Kane in the style of F for Fake. Like, for instance, if the Citizen Kane movie is slowly moving towards a total mystery solved and never solves it, isn't that what all his movies do? They're moving towards a solution, towards a mystery, and then breaking off the closure, leaving us all going, man, I wonder if they found that at the end, or if I wonder if you knew that, or you kind of point that out as an audience member, because you're like, well, I noticed that this, and this happened. Was it related to this? And always with Wells it is. Everything from the beginning of Kane, or even Heart's Vision, all the way to the end of F for Fake, is his total career in moviedom. And then he does other people's movies too, because like Cast of that is, Orson Welles would in fact take acting roles in movies so that he could become a lucrative director, or at least afford directing. You can't really afford to direct at all ever, but if you can, then I could see why you do an acting performance, not only to get to know the talent, but also to make the money you need to make the whole movie. And really, that's amazing that Wells and Cassavetes were able to make such improv movies with this sort of like complete independent flair, and that they led the way. You know, Wells led the way in American cinema. I mean, he still does, kind of. I mean, it's still like on us to be a part of that. But then F for Fake, you're looking at the end, it sort of like slips off and doesn't have a conclusion, and leaves you with this kind of doozy. There's always a doozy at the end, or it's not really an apocalyptic finale, it's like the doozy at the end. And that's when you realize this is the triumph of Wells, because he's leading you, and then it just stops. So he's pulling on you with all these beautiful moments of camera work, and the editing's so like snick snacker by, and you're like, whoa, this is cool, because here I am being totally drawn in to the cinema, and it's phenomenological. And the reason is because I haven't seen anything like it before. This is where the studios figured out differentiation, like they had in the silent era, where they could make a genre that had, or movie that hadn't been made like that ever before. And usually you're going to make a movie like what has been made before, like from The Great Train Robbery onward. So you're making these movies like that are like the same title, but then they're expanding on the Western history of film, because they're expanding on the early times that these films explain to us all as an audience that films should be this way if they're this way. And Kane's like, but they can also be like this. And now this is very experimental, because you don't always know that the style that you've come off of, the style that you're different than, you don't always know that the style that you have is that exact thing that a critic describes, for one thing. You know, a critic reception could say that the film was like this, and their answer is usually the best, because the director can get really like lost in the film and want a critic to find his way through the film. You know, like a film consultant, like they've done that, where they find out what went wrong in this other movie so they could avoid it in that one if it's a similar situation. And that Hollywood does think that out, but a lot of the silent era techniques had been lost to films disappearing. It's like we said, some of Kane might have disappeared, but now we have films disappearing. And I know you're thinking, we've heard this lecture about how like films disappear and it's we're all to blame, but really it's a natural quality of the cinema for them for the old films not to die. Now that we have digital film, or digital movies, or digital photography, there's a completely different way of exercising how the editing's done. Although the table board can be used of like taking film strips and plugging them in. Now, Orson Welles created the idea that the filmmaker could, in fact, be the one in charge of the whole movie. Why he wanted to be in charge was because he wanted his style to get through. He wanted his style to be different. And differentiation is where one is not only different than the other, but the second is intentionally different than the first to draw more box office. And box office is something that came around even before Orson Welles. This was more like a D.W. Griffith thing. I mean, box office, we all think of it today as a different thing, where it's like we collect what we make for the movie. That's what people tend to think of it, or HBO is home box office. But the box office in cinema back in the silent era was kind of how directors would use it, and that is to see how many people saw the film. And I know usually they know how many people saw it, and that's how much it made. So you look at that and you're like, okay, that's the box office. How many people saw it and how much they paid, to see it all together. And then you're like, okay, so that money comes in, and Griffith, of course, fails every time. I mean, like, he almost catches up to his own box office in Intolerance, and it's a really story that I already told in another class, but now you have Orson Welles, and he comes from the avant-garde movement and music, and he's coming out of nowhere, and he's kind of riding this course, and he's like in all these clubs, and he's seen the 39 steps in Stagecoach and knows what he needs to do for Citizen Kane. And by the time it's the 40s, the Caligari lighting's in, the deep focus long take center on the fact that this character is very upset. You see, that this character's upset, and that's what the background kind of notifies in Caligari, is that like something's going wrong, so the clouds are all askew, in the background, and it's like those things. And now what Caligari is the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari by Robert Vini. I said that before, but I say it again as German Expressionism. Like, German Expressionism takes other forms like Metropolis, and it's not just Fritz Lang. Expressionism is going with G.W. Potts and Pandora's Box, and you have all these really like modern themes even in these silent eras where the film is very, like, sometimes the shot will stay on for 12 seconds or 15 seconds, and then it'll just be this looming silent shot. And so again, we realize that it's coming of sound that shortens the shot, and by the time the jazz singer is actually capable of showing any sound in it, it's kind of going further and further with this sound idea, and the shots are going thinner and thinner. So now we're to the end of 90 minutes, and we just have the small shots of jazz singer. We see why. We see how a certain event could happen as a filmmaker that would only be shot in like 100 takes, and we narrow it down to like all the establishing shot, the close-up. The close-ups when you see me up close, the establishing shot is everything in the background. And so now you have Orson Welles merging the shots with the close-up in the background. So something like close-up and in focus, and something's in the background in focus, and you can still completely tell the depth all the way across. And that was pretty much his idea that he had talked to from the cinematographer of Stagecoach. And you're like, I know that there were other cinematographers that worked with Orson Welles, but he knew exactly what he wanted because he could see the film before he filmed it, right? Because he had to have. If he was hanging on to the, all the film stock, then he must have seen something before in his mind of what it was going to look like, because he hadn't seen the film displayed, and he knew that's the exact order he wanted it to go in. So I think, that's probably why he defended it, was because he worked so hard on like the momentum of a melodrama and film noir that it kind of becomes this like study in cinema itself. No, it really does. It's like certain shots being close, medium, a close one, and then suddenly far away, and it's like the trying of different montages out, and montage can mean rapid cutting, but can also mean a long shot that then suddenly flips off to another shot, and the editing starts going fast. So sometimes, almost always, it's a rule with a montage that the editing's going faster than the image, and then sort of the deep focus long take mise en scène, that the image is lasting longer than the editing. And this can be trying for filmmakers still, because sometimes they'll walk into a shot and know exactly how many seconds it needs to be. Sometimes they'll start analyzing it. Sometimes they'll go this way and that, looking into what is going to help him in make a movie. And it's not really help, it's like ideas burgeon. Like with Citizen Kane, Orson Welles was saying he got certain ideas from earlier movies, and you were saying that it wasn't just Caligari. There's scenes from other movies in Kane that, like everything, not kind of from before that era, is this whole like now like illusory image to like how we all built up to Citizen Kane. And I think that's a little too far. Like I can't really say that it's the most milestone in history, but it might be the most milestone in history. Like you could clearly say that he took his style and executed it through the film and completely put it on the whole wall of the film in editing, producing, directing, editing, cinematography, all these sound design. He had control of all of those things and all those aspects. He got a deal with Mercury Theater that came from Houseman, and it was all this like sort of post-war worlds. Like, let's make another shocker, and it was supposed to be this really shocking movie. Guy dies at the beginning, and he's sort of this like paced, melancholy, like greed, like ruin, where it goes towards the top of his career and just belts off, and he goes on the downward spiral. And I'm not saying that it's sort of saying that. And then there's like this whole idea that cinema and time and illusion and the things you see, that the things you see affect you differently depending on what they are. And then he's got these shots in there that are like trying to affect you as an audience, like to make you feel the emotion of sadness, that he is sad or that he's angry. We're not really giving their audience a reason to be angry. We're giving them a reason to watch someone angry and learn that actually what's really sad about the story is not many of his downfall, even in the story, was really his fault. It was like containment of a newspaper, how to put it out, and then suddenly it goes bad because he's can't run it as closely, or he's up close to it, he's up to bat with it, and can't quite seem to get it done. And I think that as we approach the last 5 minutes of this class, no, it's actually 3 minutes left, we're going to say that the point of this class is that Orson Welles, when he directs a film, had come up with a style by Hearts of Age and Citizen Kane, his first movies, that would blow audiences away completely, especially later on, but like completely confound them at first, and they'd be this sort of like long movie. It would seem longer than usual, even though it kind of is in production. And the original version we don't know, but like the final version that we see today is kind of close to this final version that he had, because he was the one that pushed it through all the way. And what he pushed through was this expressionism. And expressionism is this sort of like mise en scène that's jagged and ripped and destroyed and kind of pushed over, and although it's like all one object, still solid, solidified. That's sort of the look you get in German expressionism. And I can't really say that there are many of those that have turned down Citizen Kane as the best film ever made. I kind of agree and kind of don't. I mean, I see it as being one of the best because audiences didn't understand it till later, and when they did, they realized that it was art for the sake of art, that they were creating this sort of event to have these like shadowy fill to a sadness, to an anger of this guy who at first is unparalleled shooting up in the sky, and we're all enjoying his rise to his greatness. His rise to greatness is so Oedipal because he's got to destroy this kind of father figure of politics, and his mother figure of religion, and he's like destroying these things, deconstructing it to destroy it, throughout the film. And that we flash back all over to his different ages means that his whole life has been confusing, and it's hard to tell which memory comes first, and it's hard to know what goes in any order. And so what I'm saying is that like it's pretty brilliant that he did that on purpose, and that he bounced around on all that time, and that's how he proves that he edited it. Not that he has to, because they have that on the books, and they just keep track of that, sort of, that they can. But that he was breakout was because nobody had ever seen anything like it. And the sound design is like meteoric because it classes these pressures of time with their own explosion of sound. And everything's an explosion of image in Citizen Kane. Like where that macabre screeches and the sort of, the camera goes through it and sort of sees it as this distance X-ray of this bird, that finally shows up in front of you and disappears. It's the look of the image. It's the sounds that are boiling all around that like makes this sort of movie work, and that like they're experimental, that the shots are held longer. You pay attention, not just because of that, but because you would have anyway with a longer take. So I laid a lot on you today, but there's still so far to go. We have, 14 more times we've got to meet for this class, and we'll be back next week, hopefully barring any problems, because we had a few last week, and I'm sorry that happened, but barring any problems, this time, hopefully, we'll be back next week, and we appreciate the constant drive that we're given in Masterclass from the superiors in Masterclass who are watching over us and helping us mold this sort of rhythm of style together in our collective class. That I'm not so sure if there are any other critical studies classes out in Coursera. There probably are somewhere. Comparative lit. Harvard does the comparative lit, and I wouldn't even mind if they split these classes into comparative lit. They can do that if they want. This particular one and all of them with Masterclass, because they said I could be an adjunct professor, and I put it out there that I was doing that, and they too agreed that they could if someone could push through it, get a film program going, and now there's like this sort of little knot of criticism forming, and it seems like mise en scene and montage are now making sense to us as what they are, and it seems like German Expressionism is always this gloomy cloud of shadows, but in Masterclass we can define it sort of how we want to, but only based on the history of the film and the history of the film style, as David Bordwell would say. So we take it again to thank the film gods for creating this movie, Citizen Kane. The film god, Orson Welles. All right, we'll talk next time. All right, you guys be good, and I'll see you then.